Alors au cœur de ce monde du travail hybridé qui nous attend pour les années à venir, il y a bien évidemment la massification du télétravail.
Now that we've talked about hybrid labor, we'll be talking about massification of telework, and that'll be for 5 or 6% of European workers. That was the figure before the pandemic. We increased to perhaps 40% of workers who worked from home during the pandemic. Now, some workers have decided that hybrid labor was good for them. Labor's more and more digital, and this will continue. It has impacts on the regulation and insurances, impacts on preventers. How can we define a joint framework in the field of insurance and the regulation now that the workstations are scattered in the hybrid form? Let me introduce the speakers. They're all with us, but in a remote way, for a roundtable, a panel discussion on telework. Quite normal.
Nice to have you with us.
Edlyn, HÖLLER, you're with us.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Thank you for the invitation.
Alors, vous êtes directrice générale adjointe de la DGUV en Allemagne. Vous nous parlerez de la...
You're the Deputy Director General of DGUV Germany. You will tell us how you've adapted to manage insurances and risk prevention for workers who work from home. Then, Manuela, SAMEK, LODOVICI, you are with us as well. Hello. You're the Director of the Labour Market and Productive Systems Research Area for the Istituto per la Ricerca Sociale. We'll talk about telework and the main changeover. You've coordinated a report at the behest of the European Parliament. When the European Parliament asked for a directive on the right to disconnect, the report was produced at that moment to see how big the phenomenon was and how the regulation could help. In a minute, Catarina de Oliveira Carvalho, an associate professor, will be with us at the Porto Faculty of Law. And that's interesting because Portugal was one of the very last member states to have a specific law on telework and the right to disconnect. It's been up and running since the beginning of the year, was voted on in December. And Laurent BAILLY is with us. Hello, can you hear us? Hello, yeah. You're in charge of the service department for the insured at the CNAM, French CNAM. You will tell us how the CNAM has adapted to the new practices. There's a message that we've received that says that time is flying by. A novelty remains a novelty and is complicated with telework.
On the issue, on the regulations perspective of the telework for the years to come. You did it through, from one part, analysis of existing surveys, mostly the one from Eurofund we saw, and also with a web survey you did specifically for this report in 5 countries. 5 countries you choose because they are different state of development of the telework in the country, and you did the survey with the social partners, public institutions, in order to see the problematic they were facing. We just saw this video of the very, very first day of the telework in France, actually, years ago, decades ago. Time has passed. How did the pandemic accelerated, I would say, this telework practice for you? And do you see it as a really sustainable, massive scheme for the years to come?
Yes, thank you for inviting me. It was really interesting, the video that you presented, because it shows that it is true that the COVID pandemic sharply increased the use of telework, but this phenomenon is not new. It is a structural. It is reflecting a structural change in the way work is performed thanks to new technology and digitalization. It also depends on the greater flexibility in the labor market and the growth of non-standard employment relationship. And so it is true that the pandemic showed how much it could increase this use, but it was already there, and it is enabled by these new technologies and new ways of working. During the pandemic, the use of telework also involved types of occupations and workers that before were not teleworking, like mid and low-skilled white-collar occupations, although it is still predominant among highly educated, high levels of professional white-collar workers. The expectations, as it was said also before, is that even in the post-COVID situation, telework is here to stay, probably not on a full-time basis as during the COVID lockdowns, but in these hybrid forms that will prevail, combining remote work and working from home with work at the employer's premises. So it is important to address the challenges that these new forms of work are bringing. Some of them were already discussed this morning, but we can go over them later in the discussion today.
It's very interesting because it's not just more people doing telework, as you explain it here and in the report. It's a larger spectrum of people doing telework. And before, the people who were teleworking had the potentialities and the skills to do the telework. Nowadays, there's people who choose and there's people who have to do telework. And it makes different situations and it makes new problematics, new problems, new challenges happening, and you try also to view the challenges. We saw some of them in the first roundtable regarding the mental health issues, regarding the intensity of work. What very new challenges are appearing, coming with telework during the pandemic?
Well, there are a number of challenges in the way work is performed, coordinated, and controlled that we must consider. For example, one is how to measure working time and workloads. When you work at the employer's premises, this is easy. You are there. So for the employer, it's rather easy to see how long you are working and what you are doing. But when you are working from home or from any other place, it is much more difficult to define the working time and the workload. And so this is one issue, how to define working time and workload, allowing the worker enough flexibility and autonomy, but also allowing the company, the employers, to know what you are doing. And this is a big issue because it also depends on the job characteristics, the worker characteristics, and the place you are working. A second issue, which is very related to this, is the conflict between the digital-based surveillance methods that some employers and many employers are adopting to monitor the working of workers. Before, there was this example of with using the mouse, which is very interesting. But these type of surveillance methods are invading the workers' privacy, and also they are indicating problems in terms of workers' data protection. So there is an issue here how to balance the employer's need to know what workers are doing and the privacy and protection rights of workers. This is another issue. A third issue, which was discussed also before, is the right of safety and health at work. Again, we have seen that teleworking brings with it not only physical health issues, but also mental, social problems and issue, and also the issue about the safety and health of the work environment when you work from home or from any other place. So again, the problem here is how can we implement and enforce the occupational health and safety provisions? How can employers ensure that workers are in a safe and healthy work environment? How can we verify the work environment of the worker? The worker can say that they don't want intrusive people coming and see how the work environment is. So this can be also an issue. And then another issue, how to, and this is an issue also for the social partners, how to ensure the rights, the individual and collective rights of teleworkers when work is so fragmented in many different places and often based on individual agreement between the teleworkers and the companies. So there is a greater individualization of employment relationship and also this fragmentation of work around different places. So it is very difficult for trade union, for example, how to ensure the collective and individual rights of these workers. And these are the main issues. This means that we have to rethink the way work is performed, coordinated, and controlled. And, for example, workers need to learn how to work in a more autonomous way, how to organize their time, how to be able not to separate working time and free time, how to work also virtually with their colleagues and their managers. Companies and managers have to learn how to engage, motivate, and oversee teleworkers, moving towards a management culture more based on trust and on managing by results, which is challenges for some companies and in some sectors. And one more thing, at social level, it is important to address the risk of increasing inequalities between those who can telework and those who can't, to address the issue about data protection, online safety, cyberbullying, and domestic violence, which may increase with teleworking. On the other hand, enhancing the opportunities for some workers, for example, women with children, people with disability, older workers that may have greater opportunity to work if they can work from home.
This is the many new issues regarding privacy, regarding control, regarding risk assessment, regarding right of workers doing the telework. And there's a big movement at the moment of negotiations, of social dialogues in companies, in activity sectors, in different countries in order to put everything on the table and redefine the scheme, the limits, the rules for the work. The one done in telework, the one done at the office, this new hybrid environment of work, actually. These collective agreements, you try to look at them because you also try to look at the way to regulate this telework. It's through this collective agreements. It can be also through laws, national laws, through European also regulation. We're going to speak about this afterwards. Firstly, these collective agreements. You said that they're happening all over Europe, very important in Nordic countries and Central Europe countries, mainly at the moment. What are the limits of these collective agreements ongoing, as much as you could see them? And also, are they nowadays overpassing a lot the European Social Partner Agreement on Telework that was initiated in 2002, so quite a long time ago, and still existing?
Yeah, this European Framework Agreement on Telework of 2002 is still the main reference framework, both for collective agreement on telework, but also for legislation on telework, because it is setting up the general framework to promote telework, ensuring workers' rights at the same time with at the same level as workers working in presence, and also safeguarding the employer's interest. So most of collective agreement, but also legislation, is following those indications, so defining the limits to working time, and also now more recently this issue of the right of to disconnect, which is a way to regulate working time issues with teleworkers without reducing the teleworkers' flexibility and autonomy in organizing their working activities. They also ensure the same rights and opportunities granted to workers in presence. They include usually clauses for employers' responsibility on the provision of technical equipment and logistical support, and also for ensuring the occupational safety and health at work using risk assessment measures and providing information to workers on the potential risks of teleworking, and also stressing the voluntary nature of telework and the right to telework and the responsibility of employers in respecting workers' privacy and adopting monitoring and surveillance systems that are not too invasive for workers' privacy. However, the coverage of these agreements are rather limited, and the actual application are rather limited in those sector, companies or countries where social dialogue and the role of social partners and the coverage of collective agreements is underdeveloped. There are, however, some interesting examples. For example, in Italy, in December last year, it was signed by the Ministry of Labor and all the social partners a national protocol on smart working, the way in Italy we call teleworking, which states all this, it provides a framework on all these issues: voluntariness, adopting individual agreements, defining rules for right to disconnect, for health and safety, and so on. Another interesting agreement is the interprofessional agreement on telework signed in France by some of the social partners in November 2020, again, emphasizing the importance of collective negotiation for the implementation of new teleworking arrangements. The idea is that collective agreements are a good way to implement also the legislation, the regulation on the ground at the company and sector level, taking into account the specific issues of using teleworking in different sectors, in different companies. Another interesting, just two more I want to underline, another very interesting initiatives are also carried out at company level, especially large companies with agreements at the company level. One interesting is the one by L'Oréal to prevent domestic violence and digital sexual harassment, especially for women teleworkers, so addressing also these issues. And also the Spanish protocol to prevent workers' digital harassment signed before the COVID in 2019 in Spain. So there are interesting cases that it would be useful to monitor, to see what the effects are. The main issue is that they often do not cover small and micro enterprises. They do not cover the situation of workers that are not dependent worker in large companies. So we need to be able to cover also these workers.
They are in your report, and your report is available online. Many examples, and it's very important from Siemens, L'Oréal. You told it, but many companies, and it can be really inspirational for people who are ongoing and doing the negotiation at the moment. There's one country I would like to focus on with Catarina. It's the Portugal country, because another major way to regulate is the national law, of course. 8 states actually have national law on telework and the right to disconnect, including Belgium, France, Italy, or Spain. It's the case of Portugal. You're one of the latest to do it. The law was adopted in December, launched in January, so it's really, really quite new. But you were in 2003 the very first European country to adopt and put in practice this European Social Partners Agreement on telework. We just spoke with Manuela. Why did you need to have some more regulation that this European Partner Agreement that is existing for so long in Portugal?
Hello, good morning. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations for the initiative. Well, we were, in fact, the first country transforming the framework, the European Framework Agreement into law. So since 2003, we had a telework framework within the Labour Code. However, we had it since 2003, but shall I say, I've never seen there was no case law, not even one decision I know about telework, because according to statistical data, we had less than 0.1 teleworkers in Portugal. So we had a nice legal framework, but we didn't have almost teleworkers, so we didn't have any legal problems arising from the application of such legislation. It was a very literal adoption of the European framework, so it was quite general. When COVID, when the pandemic led to a big transformation within the forms of work, we rose from, as I said, less than 0.1 to more than 20% of teleworkers in a permanent situation of telework during 2020. Many legal problems started to arise. And the legal framework we had wasn't enough to respond to such problems. Many doubts were raised, mostly by employees, but also by employers, how to manage, how to do. There was no legal answers. Labor Inspectorate was having some hard problems dealing with all the situations related to the COVID labor legislation. And the government launched in 2021 an agenda for the decent work, a decent work agenda, and decided that it was important to review all the legislation regarding telework, because the legislation we had was not enough to respond to the problems that rose with COVID pandemic.
So this law was adopted in December, quite surprising actually. That was really adopted before the government who put it on was dismissed actually, and a new government came in Portugal. We're going to see actually the different big issues this law is trying to address to regulate telework. But before trying to regulate, is the first problematic, the first challenge is defining telework itself. We just saw on an image, we're going to see it again, the new definition of telework that is in that law. What is that definition, and what problematics are going with that definition of what it says of what telework is and is not?
One of the problems that was raised even before the changing of the legal framework was a very strict concept of telework. As we can see in the first line, this is the new definition, but it's only applicable where the legal subordination can be identified. So within within an employment contract context, it's only applicable to persons who have an employment contract, and at the same time they have to use intensively all the information and communications technologies. So it's not a synonym of remote work. Remote work was not included within the regulation of telework. We have to have an employment contract and an intensive use of information and communications technologies. Otherwise, it would be other thing regulated by other norms, but not by this specific telework regime. The novelty of this law is that the scope is going to be enlarged to other situations that, firstly, may not involve an employment contract, as long as there is some form of economic dependence. So it's not just the concept of employees, stricto sensu, a restrict concept of an employment contract, but other people working with other types of contracts can also benefit from this regulation, as long as they are economically dependent from the person who gives them the work. And it's also applicable to remote work, as you can see in the second line. So not only in situations of strict use, intensive use of information and communication technologies, but a use of such technologies that may be lighter, not such intensive. So the new law is going to, as a larger scope, is going to be potentially applicable to more situations. It's not, it's only some of the provisions, but the main ones, the provisions that regard privacy, that regard expenses, the most important ones for the employees, at least.
I would like to go shortly with the main points of this law. One major regulation is regarding the financial support for the worker who do the telework. What companies will have to pay for concretely?
Well, that was one of the main problems that rose during the pandemic situations, because from one moment to another, millions of employees were doing telework, and there was no regulation about who will buy the instruments, who will support the additional expenses, namely regarding the energy, internet. This law aimed to answer such questions and has imposed on the employer the burden of buying the equipment and preparing the necessary system and paying the additional expenses. The employee can demand for the expenses he had comparing the situations before telework. For instance, is energy account, the expenses he's had in his home if he's doing homework.
It can be electricity, it can be the electricity charges, it can be the heaters charges also, because we have to be at work all day. It can be many of this expensive.
Yeah. So all these additional expenses will be supported by the employer, although the employee has to present proof of the additional expenses that they come from the doing homework, from doing telework. This was one of the main issues that divided employers and employers' representatives and unions before the law being approved.
In a very few words, one other point which we spoke about with Manuela is the respect of privacy of data. How can you guarantee the privacy of data? How this law can guarantee it?
That was the second main issue that was raised during the pandemic, with many questions being raised to the Data Protection Commission of Portugal regarding the protection of privacy of employees. So it was quite important to regulate this issue within the new framework, and ensuring, on one hand, that the employee has a private life, a family life that has to be respected, and the employer is responsible in general for health and safety conditions, both at physical level as in psychological level. So during the pandemic, many employers had used software to control directly the employee through the technological equipment, and the capture of image was forbidden by the Portuguese Commission on Data Protection, but the law goes further and forbids all the demand for a permanent connection or control, not only through image, but also through sound, invoking all the principles that result from the data protection European regulation: proportionality, transparency, information. So at the same time, the employer is forbidden to capture and use all the information he can get from the employee computer, and to control his behavior through those data. And finally,
so the fact that there's a visit of the employer to the teleworker location, we'll speak about this afterward, because it's crucial for the assurantial regulation, requires a warning at least 24 hours in advance, and the agreements of the employee. There's a last point I want to see with you. It's regarding, of course, the right to connect and to disconnect, and the working hours, actually. The law install strict plannings, install also a right to disconnect. What are the rules and what problem could occur out of fixing so strongly working hours rules when you're in a remote or in a telework configuration?
Well, it was a question that was debated for some months. Not everyone agreed that we needed to have a regulation of a right to disconnect. But finally, in the context of the telework regulation, a new provision in the labor code was introduced regarding not specifically the right to disconnect, but rather the duty of the employer not to connect. So the perspective was put not on the employee side, but rather on the employer's obligations, because they thought it would be more effective. If there was a survey made to the Portuguese employees, and the result was somehow surprising, since more than 80% said it was indispensable for them to be connected during weekends, during holidays. So the perception they have of the need to be connected for their employer, it was rather excessive. So this perspective on the duty not to connect put the load into the employer, and it was, we'll see, since the law is very recent, but we think it would be more effective. The employer does not have the right to connect the employee. The question that arises now is what kind of connection? Could it be through an email? Could it be through an email if an email says it doesn't need an immediate response? That's still such email breaches the duty not to connect, but it has rather strong consequences. Not only it is an administrative offense, but it is considered a discriminatory practice if the employee is by any means affected by refusing to connect when is demanded. So it has all the consequences linked to discriminatory practices.
There are also points that can be shown on the screen about the rest period, which is a real problematic of, is it considered to if you're on a standby, is it a rest period or is it a work period? We're not going to go in this because we don't have time for it, but it's people can read it and we might have questions coming out of it. Just one very last point. How did the employers reacted to the law? Because they have to pay, they have to regulate. It's quite not such a good news for them, this law. Did they reacted strongly against the law?
Well, it's really not. The law mostly favors employees and not so much employers. The process of the social dialogue previous to the law was quite shortened. Even the president remembered that when he decided to publish the law, that we need to promote more social dialogue. And the social dialogue was only about the decent work agenda, and it had a very general framework, very general principles about telework. And then just before the parliament being dissolved, and quite unexpectedly, in two or 3 days, we had a new law that will come into force in 2022. So I think if the employer associations were a little got by surprise. They had been discussing the main issue they didn't approve was the payment of expenses. That was the main problem for the employers, especially in some areas, namely on services. But there wasn't so much social dialogue, so the problems weren't debated before. Now, what we can see in practice, the law just came into force in January, that many employers are saying they will not continue to keep or to allow their employees to continue in telework if they don't have neutral expenses. So if their burden of expenses is going to be higher, they will refuse telework as long as they can, because the law doesn't allow them to refuse completely. But we are starting now to have some reactions from employers' associations saying that maybe it isn't so, after all, telework, it isn't so good for them, so they will avoid it. That could be a problem for employees.
Thank you, Catarina. J'aimerais maintenant, on voit les enjeux de régulation posés par les négociations collectives, on en reparlera tout à l'heure, posés par ce...
Now, we've talked about collective labour agreements, and we've talked about national and domestic laws and the European framework that we'll be talking about again today. But now let's talk about insurance companies, and that's something essential, you see, because we have more and more working environments, and it's difficult to appraise the risks. It's also difficult to know when accidents take place and when people either are working at home or doing something else, since we're teleworking. And we'll be talking about this with other representatives from DGUV and the French CNAM, because they're facing these new practices. We'll start with you, Edlyn.
To the insurance frame, how was operated this massive switch to distant work in Germany? How do you view it as a sustainable issue for the years to come?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to share our experience. I think it is similar to the experience in other countries. Before the pandemic, telework was the exception to the rule. Data from 2019 showed that only 3% of the workers worked exclusively from their homes. 17% said that they worked from home at last for some time. This changed radically during the pandemic. The proportions fluctuate from survey to survey and from month to month. It is safe to say, though, that between 20 and 30% of all workers work from home at last some of the time. Some studies say that the potential for telework is a lot bigger, with 1 in 2 workplaces being fit for telework. Overall, though, this was and is a dramatic shift. Only 1 in 5 companies said that they did not offer telework because of the nature of their business. Obviously, neither a nurse or a mechanic can work from home. The big question is, and I think that is what you mean when you ask whether this will be a game changer, will this change be permanent? In my opinion, there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. It is safe to say that most people who have worked from home since the pandemic began, they describe their experience as positive. The overwhelming majority of employers share this opinion. Does this mean that workers want to continue teleworking? With all respect to the advantages of telework, working from home has limitations. For example, lack of personal contact and informal conversation. That is important for teamwork, innovation, and identifying with one's workers and employer. Surveys show that workers are aware of this. Only a small fraction of workers would like to work exclusively from their homes. The majority of workers would like to work to the office and from time to time for perhaps 2 or 3 days per week at home. So in the end, I would say that yes, the pandemic experience will change work organization permanently, but only to the extent that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages.
The insurance, the insurance for work accident and work disease is an issue for this work at distance, and it's an issue in Germany because you have two definitions actually. One is telework and one is mobile work actually, and they are quite not so much the same. What are the difference between telework and mobile work, and how did the pandemic put some confusion in between the two of them?
Oh, well, the difference between both concepts is mainly technical, but it, of course, has some impact on the rules that apply. Telework is an agreement between employer and worker. This establishes an office within the worker's private flat or house. The workstation regulation requires employers to set up the workstation in compliance with safety and health requirements. In contrast to this, mobile work is work that can be carried out from any place in the world and usually while moving. The classic example for this would be the manager who sits on a plane while on a business trip and writes something on his or her laptop. Employers need to assess the risks of telework and mobile work, but telework comes with additional specific requirements as to the setup of the workstation at home. When the pandemic started, a lot of office workers began, without a contract, working from home. In order to facilitate this change, the government defined these temporary arrangements as mobile work. As it comes to the question of insurance coverage, the first point you have to keep in mind is the two different concepts I have mentioned are important for safety and health regulation. They do not matter from the point of view of insurance coverage. Insurance coverage by German social accident insurance does not depend on the place of work. A work accident is defined as an accident that happens to a worker as a result of his or her work. As a consequence, remote work was covered by accident insurance even before the pandemic. As to ensure coverage, the big difference was not between telework or mobile work, but between telework and office work. The typical example would be what one could call non-essential trips to the toilet or to the kitchen. Before 2021, the way to the toilet or the kitchen in the office was covered, while accidents on the same ways at home were not covered by accident insurance. In 2016, the Federal Social Court decided that a woman who worked from home was not insured when she went to the kitchen in order to get a glass of water and slipped on the staircase in her house. This has changed. A new law came into effect in the summer of 2021. The law now states explicitly that accident insurance coverage covers teleworkers on the same extent as workers who work at the office or on the factory floor. This includes ways such as the way to the bathroom or to the kitchen. Legislators argued that the modifications were made necessary by the spread of new forms of work, and these changes were not only in the best interest of workers, but also the employers.
It's always difficult, as you say, to define the difference of the action, whether it's domestic or whether it's professional, as it's happening at home actually, and the agendas of domestic activities and professional activity are mixing all the time. You had a case law for one person who tried to fix his boiler, I guess, when he was working, had an accident about it, said it was about his professional time, even though it was a domestic activity. How can you be certain that the professional cause of an accident really is what it was said to be when it's occurring at home and it's difficult to prove it actually?
Oh, that's an interesting question because it assumes that another question has already been answered. Where exactly do we draw the line between an employer's responsibility for safe and healthy working conditions and workers' responsibility for their own safety and health in their private homes? Consider the following scenario. A man gets up in the morning in order to go straight to his study and start working on his laptop. The study is situated on the floor beneath his bedroom. The man slips on the stairs, falls and breaks a vertebra. In your opinion, should we regard this accident as a work accident? On the one hand, we have an undeniable change in the world of work. And if employers accept that you no longer need to work at the office, one could argue that they also accept the related risks. On the other hand, is it really your boss's fault if you slip on your own staircase? The case is no longer hypothetical. It was actually decided by the Federal Social Court of Germany in last December. In deciding this case, the judges applied the new law. There were already decisions from the lower courts, of course. The first instance court had judged that the accident in question was a work accident. The Court of Appeal, however, regarded the accident on the way from the bedroom to the study as not covered by accident insurance. The Federal Social Court had the final say in this case. As a consequence, it decided this was a work accident. So, as a consequence, it seems that we need to adopt a rather broad and comprehensive understanding of insurance coverage as home. This could make it easier to answer your question as to the mixing of work and private agendas. Yet, I can understand if this evokes mixed feelings.
Je voudrais qu'on aille voir un peu en France comment ça se passe, parce qu'on voit bien qu'il y a des enjeux très compliqués avec vous, Laurent BAILLY. Le recours au télétravail, il a été massif en France.
Well, we're going to listen to you, Laurent BAILLY. Now, lots of people have teleworked in France. There's no need to dwell on that. Now, what are the special claims that you've recorded? Can you measure that? Or is it a bit too complicated? That is, people have work accidents at home. Can you make the difference between the office and when people work from home? What types of cases and claims? What about the numbers, and what about the types of claims you've received in 2021, for instance? Well, of course, we have data sets, and as you were saying, if we look at the law, if you look at our forms, the forms that people have to fill out, either online or the paper forms, well, today, or as we speak, the notion of telework is not covered really, and therefore we had to poll our different branches. They are the ones who collect the claims, so we have data sets, but this is upon what people say and declare when they fill out the forms. The volumes in terms of numbers is shrinking. 1,000 work accidents recognized or reported in 2021 when people were teleworking, and these are work accidents mainly. They're different from accidents when people commute. We have 78 of those, and almost no vocational diseases recorded or declared, 5 or 6. That's all. So this is rather marginal for us. If you look at the numbers, the volumes, this should be looked at in the light of the 1 million work-related accidents that we have annually. So that's very much limited for those who work at home. Now, to answer your question, I'd say that if we look into the reasons why the accidents happened, what we see is that usually these accidents are slip, trips and falls, and pain as well, back ache, and people don't move correctly, and also fainting or malaise. And this is the type of claim that we see, or cases that we see for those works that can be teleworked. That is, when people were normally working at the office, and that's quite logical. And by the way, this can happen on premise, and usually these are not the jobs where we have the highest number of cases and claims. Okay, is it difficult for you to define the different types of work accidents at home? As we were saying before with Edlyn in Germany, at present it's complicated to define this, and it's based on case law. Well, not really for us. We have a definition, the scope of which is rather broad, to define work accident. But we have to face reality, that's for sure. Telework takes different forms. People can work from home. People also can have special assignments. For example, someone who's going to be working when they're commuting. We call that an assignment-related accident. Therefore, work accident. We have a definition for work accident in France. It's an old definition. It's not really changed. It's from 1898. That's the date of the definition. And a work accident, regardless of the cause, is an accident that happens when people are working and salaried workers, or when they work wherever they work, when they work for a company or an employer. So you see, we cover all types of accidents that might occur. There's no special detail about this, but if necessary, the Labour Code also defines what we mean by telework. The code of the Labour Code refers to this article, so as to try and assess what we call work accidents, which means that all of this is well known, the scope is well defined, and if you read again carefully the definition, you will see that there's a presumption of the cause of the accident, the work accident. If we look at two criteria, that is working hours, that is people have an accident during their working hours, and if it's where people work, this accident is said to be a vocational accident. This is an important principle for us, and therefore it's easier for us to see if a claim is a work accident or not. This was the objective of the initial law, by the way, and we apply this to telework as well, and it's going to simplify our work as well, that the CNAM will have to do to determine if this is a work accident or not, because it means that we just have to look at a number of elements. For instance, is it during working hours? Is it the usual working hours? And then we don't need to ask other questions like, was this person walking down the stairs to go to the lavatories, for instance? We don't care about this, because as long as it's within the normal working hours, and if the person has been working or was working, we suppose that this is work accident. And labour is defined on the venue, the place, and therefore the place, the venue, is where people live. And therefore, we presume that this is a work accident. And then, of course, there are extreme cases. You mentioned a few of those. Here's an example. Someone who's doing a DIY at home. This is a concept that we have in case law in France for people who already work at the office. And we have similar case law for workers or employees who decided, and by the way, I remember an example of someone who decided to repair his motorbike in the garage. And in this case, rather than looking at the subordination link with the employer, what we look at is a situation connected to work. But if it's daily life, for instance, at the office, if you fall down the stairs at the company's premise, you will be recognized as a work accident. And at present, the law makes no difference. If you're at home, it's the same. If you wake up and stand up, get out of bed, and if you're hurt at that moment, you'll be covered as if you were at the office. And there's another important point, I think, which is at stake, which is indemnification of people and prevention as well. Prevention is based on risk evaluation and also prevention messages that you send out. How can you do that? How can the different players and the CNAM branches do this? Because you have to analyze everything at a distance and in different types of environments, work environments that are very different. What are the tools that you're going to use for prevention then? Well, risk evaluation is covered by the law. It's the employer who has to do this. It's their obligation to appraise the risks. And we, the preventers, just recall the employers that they have to evaluate the risks, even those that are teleworked. And they have to draw up a single risk evaluation document that has to be reviewed if work is moving to telework. So that's the first level of risk evaluation and prevention. It's in the hands of the employers. And then if you look at French labor law, we have a definition of telework, as I said earlier on, but what we miss is that there's no obligation of special care connected to telework. This is an obligation that existed already for the other workstations. It's the definition that applies. There's no special difference. And then we have interprofessional national agreements that specify what you can do, the types of documents that you have to use, but there's no specific obligation for teleworkers. Telework is like a workstation with its risks and has to be analyzed as such. And back to what we do on the side of prevention, we, the preventers, we don't say that telework is a risk per se. It's a workstation that's exposed to risks. It's all it is. Therefore, when we decide to cover certain risks in the company, we can, for instance, target certain risks because we see that in some cases there are many cases and claims, for instance, musculoskeletal disorders, the MSDs. We, the preventers, have to help companies, and we cover all workstations, even the teleworked workstations. And we cover all of these workstations and functions. So we don't decide to specially target telework. Telework is not a risk for us. And in addition to this, I could say, as was underscored before, we don't have the resources to move and visit every single worker who's going to work from home to check what's happened and to look at prevention measures at home and what each employee and worker does. And legally speaking, we wouldn't be allowed to do that, which means that, you see, this is what we do. It's a collective approach, and we use the employers, and also we use all the documents produced by the work of the French INRS on risks connected to telework. And could we look at Germany now with you, Edlyn? Edlyn, how do you manage this as well?
Run this problematic of risk assessment and control of the risk assessment in Germany as in telework, in mobile work, it's happening at home actually.
Yes, the short answer to this question would be we don't have to do the risk assessment. Risk assessment is the duty of the employer. But of course, it is our task to support the employers when they do their risk assessment. Obviously, that's not easy in the case of workers who work from home. After all, one's home is one's home, and off limits to employers and labor inspectors. The principle is even protected by our constitution. As a consequence, there's a conflict between employers' duties and the means that employers have at their disposal to influence workers' conditions for teleworkers. In the past, it was possible to solve this conflict by adding a telework agreement to the employment contract. This agreement entitles the employer to enter the employee's home in order to set up the workstation and to verify compliance with safety and health regulations. Of course, this is not a solution which can be valid for all situations. It worked fine in those cases where your workstation at home was simply an extension of the office. Yet, if workers become more mobile and flexible, if they can work from anywhere, this approach can no longer be an adequate answer. I think we will see in the future that there is a more active role of the employees in the process of risk assessment necessary. Employees will need to acquire more expertise and awareness for their own safety and health. And they will have to enter into a constant dialogue and interaction with their employers as how to safe and health working conditions can be ensured. As a social accident insurer, it will be our role to assist this process by providing guidance and recommendations and, last but not least, training.
Je voudrais qu'on prenne quelques questions de notre audience sur les points qui ont été abordés.
I'd like us to take some questions from the audience. Maybe Laurent, should the house be home or be considered as a working place in the risk assessment technical sheet or report? Maybe that's a change to be brought. Well, yes. Home is workplace. Therefore, it has to be considered as such in the single risk assessment technical sheet. Another question: when someone is protecting himself or herself, he might be infringing the work contract when the person is leaving home while teleworking. And if this person has an accident while he or she is supposed to be at work, is that person still covered by the insurance? Well, probably not. This will have to be confirmed by case law. If the person leaves for a personal reason and not for an occupational reason, collecting a parcel, for instance, it's not the workplace anymore, because as we've just heard, the person is outside the workplace. So the accident is no longer considered as an occupational accident. So it has to be connected to the actual work. So if that person has to take a letter to the post office on behalf of the employer, it's different. Now, a question to you, or Edlyn or Catarina, because we need to consider the insurance aspect, which is also part of the law which was passed in Portugal.
La couverture d'assurance maladie contre les accidents du travail est arrangée. Est-ce qu'il y a une couverture complète ou une couverture plus limitée quand on travaille?
Insurance, how does the insurance cover this? Is it a limited insurance contract or a full-fledged insurance contract when you have a hybrid form of work, if you work from home and on site? Does the employer pay the same amount or a smaller amount, depending on the situation? Who gets to answer? Laurent? France, there is no difference. One last question to Manuela. There are indices.
Put on the mic. We don't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot. There is this index on teleworkability carried out by JRC, which is the Joint Research Center of the European Union, looking at the kind of occupations, the task involved in different occupations. And they try to see how much of the occupation could be actually done outside the employer's premises. So when there is no need for physical handling task or physical interacting with other people. And so they estimated this index, and they show that teleworkability index is highest in financial services, in the ICT sectors, in real estate, professional, scientific, and technical activities, in public administration. And so mainly in white-collar occupations. As I said before, with the COVID pandemic, also middle and low-skilled clerical occupation were teleworked. And so this changed also the composition of teleworkers, introducing new issues in ways to manage this type of work, and also introducing new issues in terms of working conditions, working time issues, right to disconnect, and risk assessment, and so on. I hope I answered.
Thanks for this enlightenment, because this is something that could be valued for the years to come, this kind of researchers. Thanks a lot for all of you to being with us for this meeting. Merci à vous tous d'avoir été avec nous pour nous éclairer sur ces cadres réglementaires, sur ces cadres assurantiels. On reviendra d'ailleurs sur le cadre.
Thank you for having been with us and for having shed the light on the insurance and regulatory frameworks applicable to telework. And we'll talk later on about the social partners agreement. On that, we'll have now the last panel discussion of the morning on European social dialogue on these transformations. Thank you.